I saw blood on my hands and thought, oh my God, what have I done? But don't panic, it was just beet juice that Diane spilled when I caught her trying to pour weed killer all over my harvest. We've all had that one neighbor, the one who thinks your land, your life, and your peace of mind somehow belong to them. Well, my neighbor Diane tried to poison my entire harvest, and I caught her red-handed. If you've ever dealt with a Diane in your life, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. Maybe yours is even crazier than mine. You won't believe your eyes when you see what Diane Wellington, the self-proclaimed HOA queen of the neighborhood, did to try to destroy my life. And now I'm facing a $2 million lawsuit for locking her in my root cellar. But wait, when you catch an intruder red-handed trying to poison the land that 3 generations of your family built, you don't just sit back, right? Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mason Redfield, and until 3 years ago, I was a software engineer living in Chicago. I had the whole urban package, the downtown condo, the ridiculous coffee budget, and the soul-crushing commute. Then my grandfather passed away, leaving me his 5-acre farm in rural Minnesota. I'd spent every summer there as a kid, and something about those memories pulled me back. So I did what any reasonable 38-year-old would do. I sold my condo, negotiated a remote work arrangement, and moved to the middle of nowhere to become a part-time farmer. The property was everything I remembered and more. A sturdy 2-story farmhouse built in the 1930s, a greenhouse my grandfather had constructed in the 70s, a chicken coop that had seen better days, but still housed a dozen happy hens in the crown jewel, a traditional root cellar dug partially into a small hillside. This wasn't just any root cellar, it was a marvel of rural engineering. 200 square ft of perfectly temperature-controlled storage space where my grandfather had preserved his harvests for decades. The walls were lined with sturdy shelving. There was basic electricity for lighting, and there was even a small composting toilet in the corner that my engineering-minded grandfather had installed just in case. Little did I know how important that addition would become. For the first 6 months, everything was perfect. I settled into a rhythm coding during the day, tending to my expanding garden in the evenings, and slowly renovating the old farmhouse on weekends. My nearest neighbor was half a mile away, an elderly couple who occasionally brought over homemade jam and seemed delighted to have someone breathing life back into my grandfather's old place. That all changed when Diane Wellington moved in. Diane had purchased the large modern house that had been built on the adjacent property a few years earlier. It was one of those monstrosities that looked completely out of place in rural Minnesota, all glass and angles, with a swimming pool and landscaping that required more water than the rest of the county combined. She was 54, immaculately maintained through what I assumed was expensive cosmetic work, and carried herself with the entitled air of someone used to getting exactly what she wanted. I later learned she owned a chain of high-end boutiques across the Midwest and had relocated to find some peace in the countryside. Apparently, her definition of peace didn't include chickens, vegetable gardens, or neighbors who didn't fit her aesthetic vision. Our first interaction should have been a warning. I was collecting eggs one morning when a throat-clearing sound made me turn around. There she stood at the edge of my property, designer sunglasses perched on her head, wearing what looked like hiking clothes that had never seen dirt. You know, she said without introducing herself, those chickens make a terrible racket in the morning. Some people around here appreciate their sleep. I explained as politely as I could that roosters make the noise, not hens, and I didn't keep any roosters. She looked at me like I'd suggested keeping alligators in her swimming pool and walked away without another word. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I received notices from the county about potential code violations regarding my chicken coop, my compost pile, and even the height of some of my tomato plants. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but the pattern was clear. When official channels didn't work, Diane switched tactics. She began hosting lavish neighborhood gatherings to which I was never invited, and I later learned from my elderly neighbors that she spent considerable time discussing how my hobby farm was bringing down property values in the area. Then came the offer. A real estate agent showed up one day with a lowball offer for my property, about 40% of its actual value. When I politely declined, he hinted that the potential buyer was prepared to make things difficult if I wasn't willing to be reasonable. I didn't. He have to be a genius to figure out who was behind it. That night, I installed my first security cameras around the property. It didn't take long for them to prove. About a week later, I was reviewing footage and noticed a figure slipping near my chicken coop after dark. It was Diane, and she appeared to be releasing something from a small cage. The next morning, I found evidence that a fox or similar predator had been prowling around the coop. Thankfully, my security measures had kept my hen safe. I took the footage to Sheriff Donahue, a no-nonsense 62-year-old who'd been serving the county for over 3 decades. He agreed to speak with Diane, but explained that the footage wasn't conclusive enough for any formal charges. Just a warning might keep her in line, he said, not sounding entirely convinced it didn't. If anything, the warning emboldened her. Over the next month, I documented 3 more incidents: garden hoses mysteriously cut, garbage scattered across my driveway, and once an unidentified powder sprinkled along the edge of my vegetable garden that I hastily washed away, worried it might be harmful. Each time I reported it, Sheriff Donahue's hands were to hide by insufficient evidence directly linking Diane to the vandalism. That's when I decided to upgrade my security system, particularly around my root cellar. By this point, I was harvesting the heirloom vegetables I'd been cultivating all summer, including some rare varietals I'd sourced from seeds across the country. This wasn't just food, it was a connection to my grandfather, and the culmination of months of work. I installed more cameras, a silent alarm system that would alert my phone, and most crucially, an electronic locking mechanism I could control remotely. At the time, it seemed like overkill. Looking back, it was the best $1,000 I ever spent. As summer turned to fall, the harassment escalated in a new direction. I began hearing from other neighbors that Diane was spreading rumors that I was growing illegal substances in my root cellar. The ridiculous allegation gained enough traction that Sheriff Donahue eventually felt obligated to check it out. He was apologetic as he inspected my perfectly legal storage of potatoes, carrots, beets, and canned goods. "Sorry about this, Mason," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "You know how small towns work. You have to follow up on reports, even the ridiculous ones." The inspection cleared my name officially, but the damage was done. I could feel curious and suspicious glances whenever I went into town. One evening in late October, I was working late on a coding project when my phone buzzed with a security alert. I pulled up the camera feed and felt my blood run cold. There was Diane Wellington using what looked like a hairpin to pick the old-fashioned padlock I kept on the cellar door as a decoy. The electronic lock was hidden and much more secure. She slipped inside, carrying a canvas tote bag that seemed unusually heavy. I watched in disbelief as she pulled out a large bottle of commercial-grade weed killer from her bag. She looked around the cellar, apparently planning where to start spraying. My entire harvest, hundreds of pounds of vegetables, dozens of preserves, the literal fruits of my labor, was about to be destroyed. My finger hovered over the electronic lock button on my phone. A moment of doubt washed over me. Was locking another human being in my cellar the right thing to do? Is this who I wanted to become? I thought about all the harassment, the vandalism, the reputation damage, and now this blatant attempt to destroy months of my work. This wasn't about revenge. This was about protecting my property and ensuring justice was served. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The barely audible click of the electronic lock engaging came through my phone's speaker. I watched as Diane, hearing the sound, rushed to the door and tried to open it. Her confusion quickly turned to panic as she realized She was trapped. She pounded on the door screaming threats about lawsuits and assault charges. I wasn't worried. The cellar was comfortable with light, a bench to sit on, and even that emergency toilet my grandfather had installed. She wouldn't be suffering, just contained until the proper authorities arrived. I've caught the intruder in my trap, I said to myself as I dialed Sheriff Donohue's number. Now I need to make sure I have enough evidence to ensure this Diane can't escape justice. The sheriff answered on the fourth ring, his voice gruff with sleep. It was nearly 11 at night. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, emphasizing that I had video evidence of Diane breaking in and attempting to destroy my property with chemicals. She's not in any danger, I assured him. The cellar is heated and well ventilated, and she even has access to a bathroom. I'm just keeping her contained until you can get here. Sheriff Donohue sighed deeply. I'm on the other side of the county dealing with a multi-car accident. It'll be at least 45 minutes before I can get there. Are you sure she's secure and safe? I confirmed both points. All right then, he said, keep an eye on her. Don't engage directly and I'll be there as soon as I can. While waiting, I watched Diane on the security feed. After her initial outburst, she'd calmed down enough to make a phone call. I couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but I could guess who she was calling. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, headlights swept across my driveway as a sleek black Mercedes pulled up. Gregory Wellington, Diane's husband and one of the most successful corporate attorneys in the state, stepped out. He was tall, gray at the temples, and walked with the confidence of someone used to intimidating people for a living. I met him at the door before he could knock. "Where's my wife?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. His voice had the practiced control of someone who knew exactly how threatening to sound without crossing any legal lines. "Your wife broke into my root cellar carrying an industrial weed killer," I replied calmly, holding up my phone to show him the live security feed. "She's currently locked inside unharmed while we wait for Sheriff Donohue to arrive. Would you like to see the footage of her breaking in?" I didn't wait for an answer. Before playing the recorded video of Diane picking the lock and entering with her bag of chemicals, Gregory's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight widening of the eyes, a tightening around the mouth. He was too experienced to show complete shock, but I could tell this wasn't what he had expected. Regardless of what that video appears to show, you cannot simply imprison someone on your property. That's false imprisonment, and I'll have you charged to the fullest extent of the law. I shrugged, unintimidated. The sheriff is on his way. He's fully aware of the situation and has no problem with my actions to secure an intruder until law enforcement arrives. Would you like to wait inside, or would you prefer to stay out here? The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and his expensive suit wasn't designed for Minnesota nights in October. Reluctantly, Gregory followed me inside. I offered him coffee, which he declined with a scowl. We sat in uncomfortable silence in my living room, watching the security feed. Diane had apparently realized her husband had arrived, as she was now speaking directly to the camera, alternating between playing the victim, "Help me, I'm being held against my will," and making explicit threats. "I will own this entire property when I'm done with you." What she didn't seem to realize was that her bag of weed killer was still in full view of the camera. I noticed on another camera feed that she had started pouring the weed killer down the small drain in the corner, apparently trying to dispose of the evidence. I couldn't help but smile slightly. She doesn't know that drain leads to a separate containment tank I installed specifically for testing soil runoff. Every drop of that chemical is being collected as evidence. Gregory shot me a look that was part disbelief, part grudging respect. "You seem to have thought of everything," he said coldly. "When someone has been harassing you for months, you learn to prepare," I replied simply. When Sheriff Donohue finally arrived, the three of us gathered around my kitchen table to review all the evidence. I had compiled a detailed file of every incident over the past months, the suspicious activities around my chicken coop, The vandalism, the false reports, and now tonight's break-in are all documented with timestamps, photographs, and video footage were available. Gregory remained mostly silent, occasionally whispering into his phone as he presumably texted his wife updates or consulted with legal colleagues. Sheriff reviewed everything thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is quite a pattern, Mr. Wellington," he finally said, looking up at Gregory. "I've dealt with numerous complaints from your wife over the past months, all of which proved to be unfounded, but this crosses a serious line." Gregory cleared his throat. "Sheriff, I understand how this looks, but perhaps we can discuss a less formal resolution to this situation. My wife may have exercised poor judgment tonight, but poor judgment," I interrupted. Unable to contain myself, she broke into my property carrying enough chemicals to destroy months of work and potentially contaminate my land for years. "This goes well beyond poor judgment," Sheriff Donoghue nodded. Slowly, "I tend to agree, Mr. Redfield. Mr. Wellington, we have two options here. I can arrest your wife for breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and possibly additional charges once we test that chemical," or he paused. "Looking between us, you folks can come to some kind of agreement that satisfies Mr. Redfield and ensures this behavior stops immediately." Gregory straightened his tie, lawyer mode fully engaged. "What kind of agreement did you have in mind?" "Mr. Redfield, I had thought about this during the long wait. Full compensation for any damages already caused to my property, a legally binding agreement that your wife will cease all harassment and never set foot on my property again, and an honest explanation of why she's so desperate to drive me away, because this isn't just about chickens and property values anymore. There's something else going on here." Gregory's poker face slipped for just a moment, enough to confirm my suspicion that there was indeed something deeper at play. "I can agree to reasonable compensation and a non-interference agreement," he said carefully. "As for my wife's motivations, I believe they're exactly what they appear to be: concern about neighborhood aesthetics." Before we could continue, Sheriff Donoghue's radio crackled with a request for his location update. After responding, he stood up. "I think it's time we had a conversation with Mrs. Wellington directly. Mr. Redfield, would you be willing to unlock the cellar now?" I nodded and used my phone to disengage the electronic lock. The three of us walked out to the root cellar in the pale moonlight, our breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. Sheriff Donoghue positioned himself directly in front of the door, with Gregory and me flanking him on either side. The heavy wooden door creaked as I pulled it open, the sound cutting through the quiet night like a knife. For a moment, nothing happened. Diane burst out like a cornered animal, gasping for fresh air. Her cashmere sweater was smudged with dirt, designer jeans stained with what looked like beet juice, and her meticulously highlighted hair hung in disarray around her face. The transformation from the immaculate, intimidating figure who had terrorized me for months to this disheveled woman was startling. She blinked in the beam of the sheriff's flashlight, momentarily disoriented before her eyes focused on the three men standing before her. When she recognized her husband standing beside me and the sheriff, a calculated shift came over her entire demeanor. It was like watching an actress step into character. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her hand fluttered to her throat, and tears instantly welled in her eyes. The performance was so sudden and complete that if I hadn't spent months documenting her true nature, I might have actually believed it. "Greg, oh, thank God you're here," she cried, her voice hitting a perfect note of distress and relief. She took a step toward her husband, but stopped when he didn't move to embrace her. Quickly pivoting, she turned to Sheriff Donoghue. "Sheriff, you have to arrest this man. He trapped me in there like some kind of animal. I was just taking my evening walk. You know I do that every night for my health, and I noticed his cellar door was ajar. I was concerned about wild animals getting in, or neighborhood children wandering inside and getting hurt." Her voice trembled with practiced precision, tears now streaming down her cheeks. I had to admire the performance on some level. The way she managed to cast herself as both victim and community guardian in one breath was almost impressive. Gregory shifted uncomfortably beside me, his eyes fixed on the bottle of weed killer, still plainly visible. On the ground inside the cellar, Sheriff Donoghue let her continue for a moment, his weathered face impassive. Then he raised his hand, palm out, stopping her mid-sentence. "Mrs. Wellington," he said, his voice level but carrying an undercurrent of authority that silenced her immediately. "We have you on video." Picking the lock with what appeared to be professional tools, entering with a bag of chemicals, and attempting to pour industrial-grade weed killer on Mr. Redfield's stored produce. There are multiple camera angles. The timestamps are clear. Let's not insult everyone's intelligence here, especially at this time of night. The transformation that came over Diane was remarkable. The tears dried up instantly as if someone had flipped a switch. Her posture straightened, shoulders squaring, chin rising defiantly. The vulnerable victim vanished, replaced by cold fury. Her eyes narrowed to slits as she surveyed the three of us, clearly calculating her options. "Those cameras are on private property, my property. He has no right to film me." "That's an invasion of privacy," she snapped, switching tactics with breathtaking speed. "And you can't prove what was in that bottle. It could have been water for all you know." Her manicured hand gestured dismissively, but I noticed a slight tremor betraying her nervousness. Her eyes darted up to the security camera, visible above the cellar door, then back to her husband, seemingly looking for support she wasn't finding. "Actually, Mrs. Wellington," I said, keeping my voice deliberately quiet and even, "this is my property, as established by the survey W.E. conducted last month after your third property line dispute. The cameras are legally placed to monitor my own buildings. As for what was in the bottle," I paused, allowing myself a small smile. "The drain you poured the chemicals down doesn't connect to the regular sewage system. It leads to a separate containment tank that my environmental engineer friend helped me install specifically for testing soil runoff. We have samples of everything you tried to dispose of." Blood drained from Diane's face so quickly that for a moment I was concerned she might faint. Her perfectly applied makeup now stood out in stark contrast against her pallor, giving her an almost ghoulish appearance in the flashlight beam. For the first time since I met her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, not the performed fear of her victim act, but the real visceral fear of someone realizing they'd been caught with no way out. Gregory recognized it too. He stepped forward and placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm as she opened her mouth to speak again. His grip tightened visibly when she tried to pull away. "Diane, don't say another word," he warned, his lawyer's instincts finally overcoming his husband's loyalty. He turned to Sheriff Donoghue, his expression grim. "What happens now?" Sheriff Donoghue looked between the three of us. "Mrs. Wellington, you're facing serious charges here. Breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and potentially environmental charges. Depending on what that chemical turns out to be, Mr. Redfield has suggested he might be open to not pressing formal charges if certain conditions are met, including an explanation of why you've been targeting him so aggressively." Diane's face contorted with anger. "This is ridiculous. He locked me in a cellar. That's kidnapping. It's a citizen's detainment of someone caught in the act of a crime," the sheriff corrected. "Completely legal under Minnesota statute, especially since Mr. Redfield notified me immediately and ensured you were in safe conditions." Gregory turned to his wife, his professional composure finally cracking. "Diane, for God's sake, they have you on video. The game is up. Tell them what they want to know or I can't help you." Something in her husband's tone seemed to reach her. Diane's shoulder slumped slightly, and she looked away from all of us toward the distant lights of her modernist house, visible through the trees. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice strained but no longer performing. "Fine. You want to know why I've been trying to get you to leave? Look up the property history. This land, your precious family farm, was part of Wellington Chemicals disposal site in the 70s before your grandfather bought it. The name clicked immediately. Wellington, the same as her husband. Your family owned a chemical company that operated here, I asked, pieces starting to fall into place. Gregory answered, his voice tight. Her family, not mine. I took the Wellington name when we married. Her father ran Wellington Chemical until it was sold in the 90s. Diane shot her husband a venomous look before continuing. This entire area was contaminated with industrial waste. Before selling off parcels of the land, the company was supposed to clean it up, but they took shortcuts. Your grandfather bought this property at a suspiciously low price. Because the proper remediation was never completed, I was the waste management director at the time. She paused, her voice dropping. If anyone ever tested this soil thoroughly, especially around that root cellar where some of the worst dumping occurred, the liability would be enormous. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Perhaps literally, given what I was hearing. You've been trying to drive me off this land or destroy my crops because you're afraid I'll discover your family poisoned it. It wasn't just me. Diane snapped. It was company policy, and when I saw you moving in and starting to dig up the soil for your precious organic garden, I knew it was just a matter of time before you discovered something. I tried to buy you out first. That would have been the cleanest, but you were so stubborn about your family legacy. Her voice dripped with contempt on the last two words. Sheriff Donoghue had been silent during this exchange, but now he cleared his throat. Mrs. Wellington, are you admitting to knowledge of illegal, toxic waste disposal and a subsequent cover-up? The color drained from Diane's face as she seemed to realize the full implications of what she just revealed. Gregory stepped slightly away from his wife, his body language changing subtly but unmistakably, a lawyer distancing himself from a client who had just confessed to a crime. I think, Gregory said carefully, that we should continue this conversation after my wife has had proper legal counsel. Someone other than myself, given the circumstances. Sheriff Donoghue nodded gravely. I believe that would be wise. Mrs. Wellington, I'm placing Y.O. under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and based on your statements, possible environmental crimes, you have the right to remain silent. He continued reading her rights as he gently but firmly took her arm and led her toward his patrol car. As Diane was being led away, still protesting and threatening lawsuits, I stood silent, processing everything I just learned. I wasn't feeling the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, a hollow feeling settled in my stomach as I watched this woman who had caused me so much grief being taken away in handcuffs. Olivia Harper, my friend and environmental consultant, who had arrived during the commotion after I texted her about the situation, approached and stood beside me. You don't seem as happy as I would have expected, she observed quietly. I'm not, I admitted. Looking at her like this, I wonder what turns a person into someone who would go to such lengths. Power, money, or just the fear of being exposed. Could any of us in similar circumstances become something like that? After a moment of reflection, I looked back toward my farmhouse and the land I'd come to love. Now I've dealt with this. Diane, but what about my land? Is it even safe to farm? Olivia, with her background in environmental science, promised to help me test the soil thoroughly and explore remediation options if needed. Gregory, looking shaken and 10 years older than when he'd arrived, approached us before leaving. I had no idea about any of this, he said quietly. I'll ensure you receive compensation for everything, Mr. Redfield, and I'll cooperate fully with any investigation. My firm specializes in corporate law, but I can refer you to excellent environmental attorneys. In the weeks that followed, my property became something of a scientific research site. Olivia brought in a team of colleagues from her environmental consulting firm, and together they conducted a comprehensive analysis of my entire 5 acres. The process was both fascinating and terrifying. Workers in hazmat suits meticulously took core samples from different depths across the property, paying special attention to the area around the root cellar, where Diane had indicated the worst dumping had occurred. Each evening, Olivia would come to my kitchen table with new data and maps. "We're finding consistent patterns of contamination," she explained one night, spreading out color-coded soil profile charts. "The good news is that it's mostly contained to specific pockets rather than dispersed throughout the entire property. The bad news is that some of these chemicals are persistent organic pollutants, PCBs, dioxins, and heavy metals that don't break down naturally over time." Her finger traced a red zone that devastatingly overlapped with my prized vegetable garden. "This area has the highest concentration. Did your grandfather ever mention that nothing would grow well here?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I remembered my grandfather's casual comment years ago that the east side of the property was stubborn soil for his explanation for why he'd established the garden on the western edge instead. He hadn't known he was protecting his family from invisible poison. He knew something was wrong, but not what I said quietly. The realization that I'd been eating vegetables grown in potentially contaminated soil turned my stomach. Immediate testing of my stored produce confirmed my fears. Subtle but measurable levels of contaminants had made their way into my carefully tended harvest. Meanwhile, the legal machinery ground forward. The EPA and state environmental agencies descended on the property with their own testing protocols. Subpoenas were filed for Wellington Chemicals' historical records, and former employees began coming forward with their own stories. One elderly man who had worked as a night watchman in the 70s provided particularly damning testimony, describing how trucks would arrive after midnight to dump barrels in hastily dug pits around what was now my property. The investigation expanded beyond my land. Other properties that had once been part of Wellington Chemicals holdings were tested, revealing similar contamination patterns. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had blown open, a decades-old environmental crime that affected dozens of families. Class action lawsuits were filed, regulatory agencies issued violations, and the current corporate owner of what had once been Wellington Chemical found itself in the crosshairs of multiple investigations. Through it all, I struggled with conflicting emotions, vindications. Certainly, Diane's harassment had been exposed for what it was, a desperate attempt to cover up her past crimes, but also grief for what had been lost. My grandfather's farm, the legacy I had hoped to continue, was literally poisoned ground. The vegetables I had so proudly grown were potentially harmful. The dream I had embraced when I left Chicago seemed to be crumbling, contaminated like the soil itself. The remediation process began in early spring, nearly 6 months after that fateful night in the root cellar. The corporate successor to Wellington Chemical, facing crippling legal liability, agreed to fund a complete cleanup of all affected properties. For me, this meant a temporary relocation while my entire property underwent massive transformation. Specialized crews removed the top 3 feet of soil from the most contaminated areas, replacing it with clean fill. Groundwater filtering systems were installed. My carefully built garden beds were completely excavated. The beloved heirloom soil that had nurtured my vegetables was carted away in trucks marked hazardous material. I moved into a small apartment in town, visiting the property only occasionally to check on progress. Each visit was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The farmhouse stood like an island amid a sea of churned earth, construction equipment, and industrial machinery. The chickens had been relocated to a sanctuary farm until it was safe for them to return. My greenhouse had been dismantled. Its potentially contaminated soil was removed. The root cellar, the epicenter of both the contamination and Diane's downfall, had been completely gutted. Its shelves and contents were carefully tested and mostly destroyed. Those months of displacement gave me plenty of time to reflect and rebuild not just my property, but my vision for the future. I found unexpected support from the community. including many neighbors who had initially been suspicious of me. Based on Diane's rumors, Mrs. Kellerman, the elderly neighbor who had once brought me homemade jam, now brought casseroles to my apartment and sat with me. As I worked through my options, land has memory, she told me one evening, but it also has forgiveness. This soil knew your grandfather's care, and it will know yours. Again, I spent long evenings with Olivia, not just discussing soil remediation techniques, but reimagining what the farm could become. Our professional relationship deepened into something more personal, as we sketched plans for a new kind of operation, one that would not only be safe, but could also serve as an educational model for land recovery and sustainable agriculture. This doesn't have to be the end of your dream, she said, her hand covering mine across a table spread with blueprints. It can be the beginning of something even more meaningful. Slowly, I began to see the land's contamination, not as an ending but as part of its story and mine. My grandfather had unknowingly purchased poisoned ground, but had loved it anyway, coaxing life from its healthier portions. Now I had the chance to heal it completely, to make it whole in a way he never could. With each passing week, as the remediation progressed and Olivia's monitoring showed improving conditions, my sense of purpose strengthened. The mission wasn't just about growing vegetables anymore. It was about regeneration, about taking something broken and making it not just functional but flourishing. 1 year later, I sat in the back row of the county courthouse, watching as Diane Wellington stood to receive her sentence. The trial had been a media sensation from the start, drawing national attention as a perfect storm of compelling elements: environmental, crime, wealthy privilege, neighborly disputes gone nuclear, and of course, the irresistible narrative of a Diane whose entitlement had finally caught up with her were among the compelling elements of the trial. The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental activists, and neighbors who had their own stories of harassment from Diane over the years. The 7-month trial had revealed far more than even I had suspected. Financial records showed that Wellington Chemical had saved over $20 million by illegally disposing of waste on what would become my property, and several others, internal memos preserved by a conscientious secretary who had suspected wrongdoing, documented how Diane had personally directed the night dumping operations and later orchestrated the falsification of cleanup reports. Perhaps most damning were the medical records from 3 former residents of properties adjacent to contamination sites, all of whom had developed rare cancers consistent with exposure to the specific chemicals found on my land. Throughout the proceedings, Diane had maintained the same haughty demeanor that I had become so familiar with, seemingly convinced that her wealth and connections would ultimately shield her from serious consequences. Her legal team had cycled through various defenses, from challenging the legality of my security videos to claiming ignorance of the company's disposal practices, to ultimately trying to shift blame to deceased executives who couldn't defend themselves. None of it had worked. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Now, as the judge prepared to announce her sentence, I noticed that Diane's practiced composure was finally cracking. Her shoulders hunched slightly, and the confident tilt of her chin had given way to a nervous tightening around her mouth. She wore an expertly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, but no amount of expensive tailoring could hide the physical toll the trial had taken. She had aged a decade and a year. Diane Wellington, the judge, began, her voice stern and measured. This court has found you guilty of 27 counts of illegal toxic waste disposal, 16 counts of falsifying environmental records, 11 counts of perjury, and 1 count each of breaking and entering an attempted destruction of property. She paused, looking directly at Diane over her reading glasses. These crimes span decades and reflect a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a complete disregard for the law, for the environment, and for the health and safety of your community. The judge continued outlining how Diane's actions had potentially endangered hundreds of people over decades, all to save money and protect her family's reputation. While your financial crimes have harmed many, it is your willingness to potentially sacrifice the health of entire families, including children, for your own benefit that this court finds particularly reprehensible. When the sentence was announced, 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, fines totaling 45 million, and a court-ordered public apology to be published in major media outlets, an audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was substantially more than the prosecution had requested. Diane swayed slightly, her attorney gripping her elbow to steady her. For the first time, I saw genuine fear replace the entitlement in her eyes. As the bailiff led her away, Diane locked eyes with me briefly. There was no remorse there, only a smoldering resentment. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only a profound sadness that someone could be so consumed by self-interest that even now, facing the consequences of her actions, she could feel nothing but anger at being caught. Outside the courthouse, a media frenzy awaited. I had largely avoided the spotlight throughout the trial, but today I had agreed to a single statement, flanked by Olivia and several other property owners affected by the contamination. I stepped up to the forest of microphones. Today isn't about revenge, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's about accountability. Miss Wellington's crimes weren't just against me or my property. They were against all of us who believe that clean soil, water, and air aren't luxuries, but basic rights. No one, regardless of wealth or status, should be able to poison our communities and walk away. I paused, looking at the sea of cameras. My grandfather taught me that land is a trust, not just a possession. Today that trust has been honored. The story exploded across social media platforms and news outlets. Diane's Cellar and Rudeller Justice became trending hashtags. Memes featuring Diane's courtroom scowl, juxtaposed with my security footage, circulated widely. Environmental groups highlighted the case as a rare example of an individual executive being held personally accountable for corporate environmental crimes. Law schools began incorporating the case into their environmental law curricula. Perhaps most significantly, 3 different production companies approached me about documentary rights to the story. After careful consideration, I selected a respected documentary filmmaker known for nuanced environmental storytelling rather than sensationalism. The resulting film, Underground Truths, The Root Cellar case, would later win critical acclaim and bring even wider attention to the issues of corporate pollution and accountability. 2 years after Diane began serving her sentence, life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. That night, I watched her breaking into my root cellar. The remediation of my property was complete, with monitoring wells showing clear improvements in soil and groundwater quality. The farmhouse had been thoroughly renovated with special filtering systems, ensuring that any lingering contaminants wouldn't affect indoor air quality. The greenhouse had been rebuilt, now housing experimental plots demonstrating phytoremediation, using specific plants to extract remaining metals from the soil. Most significantly, the root cellar itself had been reimagined. Rather than simply restoring it to its original purpose, Olivia and I had transformed it into small but powerful educational exhibit. One section retained the traditional storage function, demonstrating sustainable food preservation techniques, but the majority now served as a compact museum documenting both the environmental crimes and the restoration process. Glass cases displayed soil core samples showing the contamination layers alongside the now clean profiles. Interactive displays explain the science of bioremediation, and yes, in a small case by itself sat the bottle of weed killer that had triggered the entire investigation, preserved as a reminder of how one act of malice had inadvertently led to healing and justice. Olivia and I married in a simple ceremony on the property, surrounded by the native wildflowers and remediation plantings that now covered what had once been contaminated ground. Our wedding favors were seedlings from plants known for their soil cleansing properties, each in a small pot made from reclaimed materials from the cleanup. My former corporate life in Chicago felt like a distant memory as we built something neither of us had imagined, part farm, part environmental education center, and part living laboratory for land restoration. Visitors came from across the country to learn about our story and the techniques we developed. School groups regularly toured the property, children wittied, as they learned about the invisible threats that had once lurked beneath the surface and the innovative solutions that had addressed them. Several universities established research partnerships with us using our land to test new remediation approaches. Gregory Wellington, who had divorced Diane and relinquished her surname shortly after her conviction, occasionally sent notes about his own journey of redemption. He had retooled his legal practice to focus on representing victims of environmental contamination, often working pro bono for families without the resources to fight corporate polluters, trying to balance the scales. He wrote in one letter, "Some debts can never be fully repaid, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." As for Diane, prison had not been kind to her. Occasional media reports showed a woman transformed, the designer clothes replaced by prison uniforms, the meticulous highlights grown out to reveal gray roots, and the commanding presence diminished by institutional routine. A journalist who interviewed her for a Where Are They Now piece reported that other inmates called her the Diane of Cell Block C and widely avoided her for her continuing demands for special treatment and refusal to acknowledge her crimes. One afternoon, as I was guiding a group of environmental science students through our property, a young woman raised her hand. "Do you ever feel sorry for her?" For Diane Wellington, the question wasn't accusatory, just curious. I paused, looking out over the thriving landscape that had once been poisoned ground. "I feel sorry that someone could become so disconnected from the consequences of their actions, that they would choose to poison land and endanger people rather than take responsibility." I finally answered, "But I don't regret that justice was served. Sometimes the most important lessons come from facing the results of our choices. For this land, that meant healing. For Diane Wellington, it meant accountability." Later that evening, standing with Olivia at the edge of our property, as the sun set over fields that were finally genuinely flourishing, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us here. "You know what's funny?" I said, my arm around her shoulders. "If Diane had just left me alone, I might never have discovered the contamination. Her efforts to drive me away are what ultimately exposed everything she was trying to hide." Olivia smiled, resting her head against my shoulder. "There's probably a lesson there about how our worst impulses can be our undoing." Or maybe I added, about how sometimes locking a Diane in your root cellar is exactly the right thing to do.